Thank you for joining us in Finding God in Video Games. In today's Rewind, we're going to take a look at what I consider one of the most interesting conflicts in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU if you prefer acronyms. The interplay between the heroic Thor and his villainous younger brother Loki is oddly one of the most human and compelling aspects of the entire MCU for me, which I think is strange considering neither of them are actually human. Now, honestly, sibling rivalries are always something that is a bitter feud that neither side ever truly wins, and oftentimes the impact of a falling out between family members divides the entire family, even those who didn't have a dog in the fight and were attempting to remain impartial. And we saw that play out in a very, very real way across the entire arc of where we see Thor and all of the incredible and awesome opportunities he was given, and Loki and all of those that he felt he had to snatch for himself in order to be able to be on equal footing with his clearly favored older brother. You can even see that in their names. So Thor is named after, thunder, very, very masculine sounding thing. Thunder, rah, rah, rah. And then you've got Loki, who if you trace his etymology of his name, actually refers to him being a liar or a deceiver. Not exactly the name you'd prefer to be branded with, especially when you're already just trying to find your footing as the younger brother to somebody like Thor. As we see through the entire arc between Thor, who is given all the advantages, and Loki, who tends to have to scrap and claw to get any semblance of opportunity, their respective paths led them to two very different points, which eventually converged and allowed both of them to find their redemptive arcs within the story. We now have this very, very interesting spin-off with a different version of Loki that we get to watch and see what he would do if he was given different opportunities in life. And on the other hand, we did also get to see how the Loki that we knew and some of us loved finally made the decision to be the hero that was deep down inside of him when it mattered the most. But when I was looking at this entire storyline of this epic struggle for supremacy between Thor and his trickster younger brother, I realized that I feel like I've kind of heard this story before. In the book of Genesis, to be specific. And if you're not sure what I'm referring to, maybe this will help. This story also started with an older brother who had all the privileges and met all the criteria of a rugged, outdoorsy hunter type, clearly his father's favorite. The heir to his father's substantial wealth, he was his daddy's pride and joy. I mean, when you picture this guy, think Old Spice commercial. He even smelled like the great outdoors. Now, sure, he was a little crass, a little impetuous, and he had little time for any of the big rocks of managing a household or anything that had to do with his actual calling in life. He mostly was chasing food and adventure. But that is not the definition of who Thor, the heir of Odin's throne, was. That's actually the real life Esau, son of Isaac, an heir to the throne and covenant of Abraham. Just like Thor, Esau had a conniving younger brother who was all too eager to outwit his older sibling and take the throne that he believed was better suited for him. And so the story begins. Now, if you want to start at the beginning of any story, let's go all the way back to the birth of this trickster younger brother, Jacob. He exploded onto the scene in Genesis chapter 25 with a birth that kind of announced his true nature to the world right from his very start and earned him his name. He was the second born of twins, and when he was born, his hand was clasped to his older brother's foot as Esau emerged first and claimed the birthright as the older dominant brother. As Jacob emerged from the birth canal, he was still grasping his brother's heel, so he was christened Jacob, which literally is defined as he who grasps the heel, and carries the meaning of a deceiver. And as Jacob would live up to this trickster reputation for the majority of his days, you also have to kind of wonder how much of what came next in his life was built into his DNA, and how much of it was the result of receiving that name and that branding before he even opened his eyes for the first time. Jacob is going to play right into the role as Loki to his older brother's Thor, tricking his stronger but less tactical brother into selling him his birthright in a moment of weakness. And then he claimed the blessing of his father through an elaborate facade that would make the shape-shifting Loki jealous. See, Jacob was preferred by his mother. So the two of them worked together to take advantage of Isaac's blindness. And through their subterfuge, they convinced Isaac that Jacob was actually Esau. Jacob lied, cheated, and stole the Abrahamic covenant right from his own flesh and blood brother. And much like Loki, his outright theft of the throne was the final nail in the coffin for an already very strained relationship between the two brothers. Esau was not thrilled about how this went down, and the trickster Jacob chose discretion as the better part of valor, and he fled, and unfortunately never got to see his beloved mother in this life again. But this wouldn't be much of a story if there wasn't a redemptive arc, would it? I mean, despite the despicable means by which he procured it, the blessing had always been intended for young Jacob. It was actually prophesied before his birth that the older brother would serve the younger. But Jacob seemed convinced that the only way he could achieve the promises of God was by taking matters into his own hands. Much like the prodigal son, Jacob didn't trust the timing or the process, so he'd made the decision to take what he thought was his by craftiness instead of accepting that it would eventually be his by promise. Jacob was truly living up to his name as a deceiver, and he continued to leverage his deceptive mental acuity rather than lean into his spiritual faith, as he made things right for himself through trickery and misdirection. He escaped his childhood home with both the blessing and the birthright. Then he used some really unique mad science for his time to unscrupulously build himself a fortune in livestock right underneath the nose of his equally duplicitous uncle. Once that jig was up, Jacob made a midnight escape from his uncle Laban's farm with a large amount of ill-gotten gain that was supposed to set him up for his next escapade. But unbeknownst to Jacob, his time as a deceiver was up, and his day of reckoning was at hand. Jacob had escaped the wrath of Laban, only to find out that he was heading directly towards his older brother Esau, who was approaching him with 400 men and 20 years of unresolved sibling issues. So of course Jacob was expecting the worst, so he immediately began doing what he does best, calculating the odds of survival and trying to cheat one final victory out of this apparent no-win scenario. He split his family and belongings into two separate camps, so at least one would have a fighting chance of escape. He even prepared lavish bribes and sent them ahead to try to soften up his older brother ahead of this meeting. And after he had done everything he could think of to survive and fight for just one more day, he offered up a prayer to the Lord. He sent his family across the river for safety, and he decided to spend his final night before this confrontation alone. Now, when it's the night before anything important we're going to do in life, maybe it's a meeting at work, maybe it's a major life event like moving or a critical test at school, or, when you're about to be murdered by your enraged older brother and his private army, well, it's very important to get the right amount of rest. And knowing that this was quite possibly the final day in his life, you would think that he would at least get the luxury of one last night of peace before he walked that green mile. But God had other plans for this night. There would be no sleep this time. There would truly be the last day in the life of the conniving Jacob, but not in the way he was anticipating. The Bible captures what happens next with enough ambiguity to keep Bible scholars busy for decades, but the result is crystal clear. It says that there was a man who wrestled with Jacob until the breaking of the day. And if you look into the actual context of it, it's implying deity about this man. Now, there's theories that abound. Some people say that this was an angel, others a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus Christ, or perhaps it was God the Father himself appearing as a man, similar to the way he chose to appear to Abraham. But rather than engage in a lengthy discussion on the identity of who this mysterious midnight wrestler was, I think we'll benefit more from unfolding the story from Jacob's point of view. See, whoever decided to grapple with him that night, Jacob didn't know who it was either. He was simply responding to an unprovoked attacker. And he was at his breaking point, completely out of room to retreat, and Jacob was now in a life or death struggle that made the problems of tomorrow fairly meaningless. I mean, if he didn't survive this surprise encounter, he wouldn't be around to worry about Esau and what fresh problems were awaiting him in the new day. Now, Jacob may have mentally surrendered himself to the idea of sacrificing his life to Esau so his family would survive. But he had no intentions of losing this battle. And this wrestling match literally lasted until the sun was coming up. Now, I'm not sure what experience you have with wrestling. That sounds like a really long time. I mean, 60-minute Iron Man matches are already really rough. I can only imagine the idea of wrestling all night long with a divine being. But Jacob reached deep down, deeper than he probably knew he had, found that there was more to him than just being a savvy con man. At this point, it would have been easier for him to give up and simply let this unwinnable situation become the end of his story. But Jacob persevered, and he finally took the first step into becoming who he was truly meant to be. Kind of reminds me of Loki when all the chips were down, and he knew he was faced with a no-win scenario. He finally chose to do the heroic thing and stand up to an oppressive dictator, knowing it would likely cost him his life. In this battle that Jacob refused to lose, he also refused to submit. And the scripture records that the being with whom Jacob was engaged in mortal combat with saw the sun was coming up, realized that the Iron Man match was running out of time, and dislocated Jacob's hip and instructed Jacob to let him go. Which is kind of interesting. I mean, how in the world would Jacob be the aggressor now? You'd think he would be more than happy for them to go. Even with a dislocated hip and no chance of winning, some point in this interaction, Jacob's WrestleMania matchup with God, he decided that he wasn't going to run, and neither was his opponent. This would not end the way it always had in the past. And when the Lord looked at Jacob, he no longer saw the trickster and deceiver named Jacob. He saw something more. He saw Israel. When Jacob flatly stated that he would not release his opponent until he received his blessing, Jacob finally received the blessing he had been searching for his whole life. Not the blessing that he stole from his brother, not the blessing he impersonated his brother to receive from his father, not the blessing that he stole from his uncle. Those blessings didn't change Jacob, and clearly they didn't satisfy him. But with one sentence, the eternal potter finally took this incredibly difficult lump of clay and transformed him into what he was destined to be. He announced to him, "Your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and man and have prevailed." Jacob the heel grabber finally died, and someone new was birthed. As Jacob and his still displaced hip was now left alone to ponder this unique event in human history, he began to realize that something had changed. And he stated that he had a face-to-face encounter with God and survived it. And even though Esau was still on his way and nothing had visibly changed about Jacob's situation, he was now changed as he took his first steps in the shoes of Israel, a name which means Prince with God. Jacob may have been his birth name, but the God who calls things that have not occurred as if they've already happened saw Israel in him before he was even born. So I guess when we look at this, we have to ask ourselves the lesson that we learn from this. What name have we been saddled with? What labels have we had ascribed to us that were unfairly a part of our lives, or maybe fairly earned, but we'd rather not carry now? What future was baked into us from childhood, even if we were partly to blame for some of it? I know many times in my life, I have become so tired of being called something negative or accused of doing something wrong that I finally got tired of it and decided if that's how others see me, I guess that's who I will be. Now, it's a horrible response, to be sure. That's not something I'm encouraging you to do. But, I mean, if I'm already labeled a failure, a loser, or worse, then my motivation to prove that person wrong can only go so far before I finally succumbed to the weight of the label. Just as we saw with Jacob, Israel, it may be human nature to lean into the groove that others have carved for us, but God has other plans. He sees the potential within the prodigal. He has a name for us based on the finished product that we will be, not the lumpy clay that we may currently resemble. When he looked at Jacob, he saw the nation he was destined to birth, and the generations of men and women who would proudly call themselves Israelis in honor of their flawed but determined patriarch Israel. We cannot control the labels that others place on us. It's even harder to remove the stigma attached to those names if we've lived up to some of those negative attributes previously. But I want to encourage you today to keep on wrestling, keep holding on to the Lord, and refuse to quit. Now, Jacob didn't win that fight. He simply never stopped fighting, and that's all it took for him to achieve victory. Now, we may already be exhausted, and our situation may be both urgent and hopeless the way Jacob's was. Let's just endure until daybreak. The night undoubtedly will seem forever long. Our opponent that we are struggling with may feel like it is God Himself. But don't give up. And when we suffer a seemingly game changing setback, the way that Jacob did when he had his hip dislodged, let's pray and fight even harder. Just as we saw Loki embrace his true heroic capabilities in the moment that his brother needed him to do it the most, our true nature and destiny will finally emerge as a result of the conflict that we are currently battling. And as Jacob learned, it is only when we make up our mind that surrender is not an option that the victory can finally be found.